Yesterday, the Food and Drug Administration issued guidelines for producers of generic opioid painkillers to make the drugs more abuse-resistant. This is the latest in a series of proposals to combat the opioid epidemic sweeping the nation. So just yesterday, the FDA, as I said, released certain guidelines that are making it harder for generics to be abused. So as of now, name brand opioids such as OxyContin, Vicodin and what have you, they have these abuse deterrent properties. But up until this point, generic drugs, they have more of a streamlined way of being approved by the FDA. So what these guidelines released say is that they just have to go through extra studies to determine whether or not they are abuse deterrent, which is a big thing considering a lot of times people use generic drugs. They're much easier to acquire, they're cheaper, and what have you. So Dr. Robert Califf, who's the FDA commissioner, he had this to say with regards to the guidelines released. He said, quote, "Today's action reflects the important role that generic drugs play in the United States, especially for patients in pain. Generics are crucial to delivering appropriate and affordable patient care. We recognize that abuse deterrent technology is still evolving and is only one piece of a much broader strategy to combat the problem of opioid abuse. But strongly encouraging innovation to increase access to generic forms of abuse deterrent opioid medications is an important element in that strategy." What I like about him saying that is the fact that he says, we know that this is not going to completely combat the issue, but I do like that there are these moderate steps being taken to try to address this problem, which is over 20 years in the making. What do you think?
Oh man, I mean, like you said in the beginning, drug abuse, especially prescriptions, it's sweeping the nation, and that whole issue gets swept under the rug. People don't talk about it enough. Meanwhile, you have taboos about things like marijuana, right? Mm-hmm. And you have people going to jail because they have some weed on them because they're trying to help them sleep or alleviate headaches, whatever it is, a drug that poses absolutely no risk to your body. And then you have things like oxycodone, mm-hmm. or something like that. That's completely legal and people are dying from it. It's basically prescribed heroin, right?
Yeah.
So we need to understand that measures need to be taken, and this is a serious issue. So while this is still a baby step and it might not change the whole thing, it's very necessary, and it's something that I'd like to see more of.
Well, and like I was saying, it's not, like I said, this is 20 years of, drug companies being able to advertise directly to consumers. You have people, I mean, the biggest issue is the fact that 100 million Americans are suffering significant pain. So they need some ways of dealing with that. The problem is the overprescription and the fact that it is so easy to abuse these drugs because they are so powerful. To give you a bit of an idea, I've covered this before on The Lip, that 28,647 deaths were as a result of prescription opioids and heroin in 2014, which more than 6 in 10 overdose deaths were as a result of opioids that year. So again, this is another measure. Just a couple weeks ago on March 15th, or last week rather, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they told us that more than 120 Americans die from overdose every day. They released their own guidelines so that prescribers and manufacturers will limit people's ability to abuse these drugs. So there's recommendations meant to help doctors minimize the use of opioids for people that are not either cancer patients or dealing with end-of-life care.
That must be very difficult to try to come up with a way to make it more difficult for people to get high on these kinds of drugs.
Yeah.
What kind of stuff can you really do?
Well,
you can't tell someone what not to do or what to
exactly,
do. So.
But I mean, kind of simple steps such as making them harder to be able to crush up and snort, making it harder for them to dissolve so that okay. People are shooting them up. It's these kinds of things. But then also, like the CDC's guidelines have a lot to do with the prescribing mechanism. So doctors a lot of the times have been put into difficult positions where, yes, they might know the abuse risks, but they also, it's a business, right? They're worried about their patients going elsewhere. So it's this really tricky thing.
It also bothers me that the fact that, in this country, there's no laws against the fact that you can advertise drugs like this on television.
Right.
I don't think that should be allowed. And we're one of the few countries, I think it's the US and New Zealand, randomly of all countries, that allow the advertising of prescription drugs like that on television.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be like, do you suffer from things that everybody suffers from
opioid-induced constipation. Like, you're taking so many opioids, now you can't go to the bathroom. There's some drugs for that. Yeah, well, and I talked about the Al Franken bill that he had proposed to try to cut the tax breaks for manufacturers that advertise directly to consumers. So again, all these baby steps, I sort of think back on big tobacco about, different things and measures that were meant to kind of take them down a peg. So also Dr. Tom Frieden, who's the director of the CDC, he had to say in the New England Journal of Medicine, he said, quote, management of chronic pain is an art and science. The science of opioids for chronic pain is clear. For the vast majority of patients, the known, serious, and too often fatal risks far outweigh the unproven and transient benefits. So to him, people that are being treated with opioid painkillers, they should be on them for maybe 3 to 7 days at most for acute pain. But a lot of times people are on these drugs well beyond that, weeks, sometimes months, and then that's what
Legally,
leads to
they're
abuse.
being prescribed that amount. So
right. So while it's a minor step, I do think it's an important step in the fight against the opioid epidemic.